The measures that are being put in place aimed at controlling the spread of coronavirus are unprecedented in Australia's history, and the situation is changing on a daily basis. It's obviously having a serious impact on a lot of organisations as employers and staff try to adjust and in many cases stay afloat. And it no doubt raises a lot of questions about workplace legislation and regulations. Mapien is a national workplace strategy specialist focused on helping employers navigate the complexities of human resources and industrial relations. My name is Simon Shepherdson, and I'm joined on the phone by Alex Aspromourgos, Chair and Executive Director of Mapien, to discuss some of the key questions that employers are raising. Alex, thanks for your time.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Simon.
Well, with some of the controls that have been imposed around self-isolation, a lot of employers will obviously have questions about leave and pay obligations, so let's start with that. If an employee is required to self-isolate for a period of time, maybe because they've recently returned from overseas or suspect they've come into contact with an infected person, what leave are they entitled to?
Simon, believe that a person who has an obligation to self-isolate, either because they've returned from overseas or they've had contact with someone who is tested positive for COVID-19, is largely driven by their employment arrangements, their employment contract, their award that applies to them, or their enterprise agreement. But generally speaking, an employee in that situation is not entitled to be paid personal leave or sick leave because they are not actually ill or injured, which is what the usual requirement for payment of personal leave is. However, there are other forms of leave which they do have an entitlement to access, and that would include annual leave, long service leave. In some organisations, people accrue time off in lieu or toil, or they have access to rostered days off. What we also see on occasion is that these individuals, because of the nature of the work they do, that they're able to work remotely or work from home. So we have seen lots of employees requiring self-isolation, continuing to work in a normal manner, just in a different work location. Now, that's the situation basically with permanent employees. With casual employees, they don't have any access generally to any form of paid leave. So those employees would generally be confined or isolated during that period without any access to specific payments. However, I note that the government has encouraged casual employees who are affected by COVID-19 isolation requirements to seek payment through Centrelink, be that a Youth Start allowance or some sort of Job Start type payments.
And Alex, what if an employee is required to stay home to care for somebody who's sick, or say if schools close and they need to look after their kids? Likewise, what are the entitlements when it comes to leave?
Simon, I'll deal with the more straightforward issue first, and that's if an employee is required to care for someone who's sick, and these usually members of their immediate family or their household, so someone that they live with. If they're required to care or support someone who may be impacted by COVID-19 in some way, then they have the capacity to access their accrued personal leave or sick leave for that purpose. If they don't have sufficient accruals of personal leave, most employers are making annual leave, long service leave, time off in lieu, or RDOs also available for that purpose. Once again, casual employees don't have access to paid forms of leave, so generally that would be unpaid for casual employees. The prospect of school closures is real and is going to have a significant effect if that comes to fruition, as is predicted. So the impact of schools closing obviously means that there will be lots of children who will be unexpectedly require care, supervision and support by their parents or primary caregivers. This situation, the children themselves are not ill or injured, so in the normal course, they're not being cared for because of that, and personal leave would not be available. However, there is a requirement to make personal leave available in circumstances where an employee has an obligation to care and support another individual because of an unexpected emergency. So during that period of time where, for example, today we're advised tomorrow schools will close and they'll be closed until Easter, people will need to make alternative arrangements. So the unexpected aspect of that need can be accessed via personal leave entitlements, but it's not forever. So it only lasts for the period of time which reasonably a person could be expected to make alternative arrangements. And that will vary from individual to individual based on their personal situation and circumstances and a number of other factors. Again, like in most instances, permanent employees will have other forms of accrued entitlements or paid leave that might be available for them to access to support them during the period. So annual leave, long service leave, rostered days off or time off in lieu if those arrangements are in place would apply. Again, casual employees, they do not have access to any form of paid leave for that purpose, but they do have an entitlement under the Act for unpaid leave. But essentially, that's just leave without pay.
Okay, if I'm an employer and one of my staff presents at work with, say, cold or flu-like symptoms, am I within my rights to tell them to leave the workplace and force them into self-isolation?
It's certainly at the moment there's a heightened concern, obviously, around flu-like symptoms, which may be indicative of COVID-19 or may just be indicative of the normal flu. So the symptoms are very, very similar, and for the layperson, it's very, very hard to distinguish. So a number of employers are taking a very low-risk approach to managing these sorts of conditions when they are identified in members of their workplace. So from a workplace health and safety perspective, having regard to the current COVID-19 outbreak and the risk of escalation that we continue to be peppered with through the media on a daily basis, I think it is reasonable in those circumstances for an employer to initiate measures to control that, which includes directing people to go home and to seek medical advice and support to ensure that they are in a state where they are fit to return to work. And while this focus is around COVID-19, this is a general kind of workplace health and safety type obligation.
And if an employee contracts the virus in the course of their work, which may be a concern, say, for people on mine sites or remote oil and gas platforms, would they be covered under workers' compensation?
The workers' compensation arrangements in relation to COVID-19 are relatively straightforward legally. So if an employee in the course of their employment contracts a disease, whether that be COVID-19, asbestosis, whatever, if employment is determined to be a significant contributing factor, then that would be covered by workers' compensation. Currently in Australia, the incidence of infection, while alarming, is still relatively low, and the authorities are initiating measures to identify the source and therefore restrict its ongoing spread. So in the current environment, it is relatively easy to establish where the infection may have arisen. And for that reason, it will be possible for employees who do become infected at work to get workers' compensation insurance. As the virus spreads and the number of cases increase, it will be much harder to identify the source. So in circumstances where you cannot identify the source as being work-related contact, then workers' compensation will not be payable.
And what if an employee reasonably expects that they may have been exposed to somebody at work and are therefore required to undergo medical tests and potentially self-isolation? Would they be covered?
In terms of workers' compensation, coverage is dependent upon a disease being present. So if you come into contact with someone with COVID-19 at the workplace and you do not, in fact, become infected with COVID-19, work cover will not apply because you do not have an illness or disease. In the current circumstances, what we're seeing is that work cover is taking quite an expansive view to this issue, and they tend to be providing coverage for medical expenses, but not necessarily anything beyond that. From a workplace perspective, the approach from employers where contact with COVID-19 occurs in the workplace is a little bit different than whether it occurs, you're required to self-isolate because you have contact with someone outside of work or because you are returning from overseas. So most employers in a circumstance where you're required to self-isolate due to work-related COVID-19 contact tend to be allowing employees to access personal leave for that purpose. And again, where personal leave is not available, there are sometimes other forms of accrued entitlements like annual leave, long service leave, time off in lieu, or RDOs that may be able to be accessed.
Now, some workplaces are being forced to close, or they may be forced to close in the near future, such as entertainment or sporting venues. Are they still obliged to pay staff if that is the case?
The issue of enforced shutdown is very complicated. So in the current situation, the federal government has banned mass gatherings. It was originally 500 and it's now been reduced to 100. What that effectively means is that many entertainment, event and attraction-based businesses are unable to operate because of the impact of the ban. So the Fair Work Act contains a provision which allows an employer to stand down employees in circumstances where they cannot usefully be employed, and that is due to a stoppage of work over which the employer cannot reasonably be held responsible. So clearly the COVID-19 outbreak is not the responsibility of any employer in Australia. The measures taken by the federal and other governments to minimise its spread and impact upon the Australian economy and community, again, is outside the control of employers. So in circumstances where a ban or direction from government effectively requires a business to close, then an employer can stand down their employees without pay for as long as the ban is in place. One of the real challenges at the moment for both employers and employees is we have no idea how long that will be. We don't know whether it will be 1 week, 2 weeks, 2 months, 6 months. And it's that lack of certainty and lack of clarity is raising levels of anxiety across the nation. Now, the fact that an employer may stand down employees without pay doesn't necessarily mean that that's what will occur. So most employers, given the current situation, will firstly look at allowing employees to access forms of accrued leave that may be available to them. So annual leave, long service leave, time off in lieu, and RDOs. Some employers are also looking at keeping some employees engaged, and whether that's sharing that work amongst a group or there's a specialist skill that is required. So even in a closed down circumstance, there may be some opportunities to continue to employ some employees, finance, sales, looking for forward sales of commodities or products, maintenance employees to undertake a work that might otherwise be done out of hours or during close downs are some examples of that. So it's very much each employer is addressing this issue in a different way. Some large corporates have looked at paying employees for a period of time, but again, that period is not going to be unlimited. So currently, some employers are paying employees special leave up to a period of 2 weeks, but that's without really knowing how long this crisis may continue.
Okay, and what if I choose to voluntarily close down my workplace as a precautionary measure? Can I force staff to take leave or work from home in those sort of situations?
A decision to voluntarily close down a workplace needs to be taken in the context of the impact on employees. So generally, there's no general right to direct employees to take accrued annual leave or long service leave, and there are legislative and industrial instrument restrictions around that. Now, all those restrictions can be waived by agreement between the parties. So there's certainly an ability to get employees to agree as part of a short-term, COVID-19 business response strategy to get them to agree to take a period of annual leave, and that can provide certainty of payment for the employees over the period and provide the employer with some relief. Most awards or industrial instruments will give an employer more power to direct the taking of rostered days off and time off in lieu, and if the particular employer does have those sorts of entitlements, then there would be generally an ability to direct that they be taken. In the current environment, working from home may be a viable option for many employees, and it has a dual benefit. The benefit to the employee is that they remain in employment, but also that they are not necessarily exposed to risks of contracting COVID-19 because of working in a location with multiple people or travelling into work on public transport or all the various incidental contacts that we have with individuals throughout our working day. They can work at home in an isolated environment free from those forms of exposure. So many employees are actively pursuing those opportunities. Equally, employers are using it as part of a business risk mitigation strategy where they can split their workforces into different locations. If all of your workers are centralised and one employee contracts COVID-19, you will then effectively be required to close down that work location, and all employees that had contact with the infected employee will be required to go into self-isolation, and that will be done on an urgent basis without necessarily having the ability to plan work from home arrangements. So there is incentives for both employers and employees to make work from home arrangements available and effective during this period. If an employee refuses to work from home, then it really comes down to whether there is a capacity for the employer to give a lawful and reasonable direction for them to do so. One of the factors taken into account in determining that would be the current health scenario facing the community, but that of itself won't be sufficient to allow that to occur, and you'd have to look specifically at their employment contract and other industrial instruments that might apply to them. But my experience at the moment is that employees understand and appreciate the stress and pressure that employers are under, and they're working with them to try and come to reasonable working arrangements which will allow them to continue in employment and also for the employer to continue their business operations.
Well, no doubt a lot of employees are also feeling that sort of stress and pressure about what the future holds for them, and that would impact productivity and effectiveness at work. So what sort of things can employers do to ensure their workforces remain focused and engaged in times like this?
One of the greatest issues in the current COVID-19 scenario is the uncertainty as to its extent and duration. Employees are being bombarded with media speculating as to length and depth, rate of infection, rate of death, etc. So everyone is looking at worst case scenarios and planning for those. At a workplace level, it is important that the employers manage the uncertainty, manage the expectations of employees, and to show empathy with their situation and to share the things that they are doing at the workplace to try and work through the challenge. The challenge is a shared challenge. This is not something that the employers can resolve by themselves and in isolation from their employees. And it's a challenge which employees need to be engaged with to try and assist employers in implementing arrangements which will best meet the needs of everyone. Now, that may not always be possible, and there may be some significant and drastic actions that are taken. But the only way that an employer will survive and be prosperous into the medium to long term is to ensure that their employees are on this journey with them. Those that are rightfully considering restructuring, standing down without pay, redundancies, all these sorts of issues that we see in the press, they're legitimate reactions, but the effect of that on the organisation in the medium to long term needs to be considered. We will get through this COVID-19 outbreak. Organisations that come out the other side will be stronger for it, and part of that process is ensuring that you have employees able to immediately respond, come back to work, get up to speed quickly once we are in a position to go back to business as usual operations. Now, that means that employers must, as much as they possibly can, take into account the interests of their employees and the decisions that we are currently making. So standing down without pay for a period of time, it may be temporary, is something which needs to be considered, but needs to be discussed with employees. Employees need to be given some notice that this might occur, what the chances are, options given, and options could be working flexibly from home, being paid annual leave, perhaps not in full blocks, but in small amounts. So you might have a situation where you're planning for effectively an 8-week shutdown. Employees have 4 weeks leave accrued. Let's pay them half each week for 8 weeks, rather than giving them 4 weeks up front and then them being without pay for the final 4 weeks. but it's about consultation, it's about communication, it's about engagement, it's about trying to get the employees supporting the business, because at the end of the day, once the business comes back, that's going to ensure their long-term financial security.
Well, thanks very much for that very useful advice, Alex. It's obviously a very complex issue and one that's going to probably keep changing day by day. If anyone's seeking more information, what should they do?
But thanks, Simon. Yes, certainly we have been constantly dealing with COVID-19 questions since the outbreak started, and we're certainly keeping up to date with the developments day by day, hour by hour, and sometimes it changes by the minute. So if anyone needs support and help, we're certainly here and available to do so. And I would just suggest in the first stage, perhaps they refer to our website, which is www.mapien.com.au. We also have a frequently asked questions brochure, and that is available for downloading from that website.